The fluorescent lights of the Sterling Security Group headquarters hummed with a sterile, aggressive energy. It was a Monday morning in Virginia, the kind of morning where the air felt thick with coffee breath and the silent pressure of being the best. In the center of the main tactical briefing room, a group of men stood in a loose circle, their chests puffed out, laughing over stories of weekend hunting trips and old tactical wins. They were the elite, or at least, they told themselves they were. Most of them were former Tier 1 contractors or retired police captains who had spent years leaning into their reputations. When the heavy glass door at the end of the hall clicked open, the laughter didn't stop, but it certainly changed its tone. A woman walked in. She wasn't wearing a tactical vest or cargo pants with a dozen pockets. She was wearing a simple dark navy blazer, a charcoal gray shirt, and slacks. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, efficient bun, and she carried a single leather messenger bag over her shoulder. She didn't look like a threat. She looked like someone who had come to fix the printer or audit the payroll. "Can I help you, miss?" "The yoga studio is 3 blocks down," a man named Vance called out. He was the unofficial leader of the morning ego boost session, a man whose neck was wider than his head, and whose ego was even larger. The rest of the guys chuckled. It was a cheap shot, but in this building, cheap shots were the local currency. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't even smile. She just walked toward the front desk, her steps light and rhythmic, barely making a sound on the polished concrete floor. She reached into her bag, pulled out an ID badge, and set it on the counter. "I'm the new tactical integration lead," she said. Her voice was calm, disturbingly calm. It didn't have the high-pitched nervousness of a newcomer, nor did it have the forced gravel of someone trying to sound tough. It was just level. Vance walked over, leaning his elbow on the high counter, invading her personal space. He didn't look at her ID. He just looked her up and down with a smirk that was meant to be belittling. "Tactical lead? Honey, I think there's been a mistake in HR. We don't really do integration here. We don't really do integration here. We do security. Real security. This isn't a desk job where you can hide behind a spreadsheet. This is a high-pressure environment." The woman, whose name on the badge read Cassidy, finally looked him in the eye. Her eyes were a very dark, steady brown. They didn't dart around the room. They stayed fixed on his. "I'm aware of the environment, Vance. I've read your last 3 quarterly reports. You're over budget on ammunition and underperforming on reaction time drills. I'm here to fix that." The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the vending machine in the corner. For a group of men who prided themselves on being alphas, being told they were underperforming by a woman who looked like she belonged at a PTA meeting was the ultimate insult. Vance's face turned a deep shade of red. He let out a sharp, dry laugh. "Oh, you've read the reports. Well, that changes everything. Everyone, listen up. The librarian is going to teach us how to shoot and move because she saw some numbers on a page." A man in the back, leaning against a weight rack, chimed in. "Hey, Cassidy, right? Do you even know which end of a sidearm the lead comes out of? Or did you just watch a lot of movies?" Cassidy didn't take the bait. She simply adjusted the strap of her bag. "I'm not here to talk about my hobbies. I'm here because your client requested a top-down evaluation of your physical protocols. If you're as good as you say you are, this should be a very easy day for you." "A day? You think you're going to evaluate us?" Vance scoffed. He turned to the group, playing to his audience. "Tell you what, we have a welcome tradition for the new hires. We're heading down to the training mats for the morning warm-ups. Why don't you come down? You can take notes from the sidelines. Maybe you'll learn what tactical actually means." "I'd prefer to participate," Cassidy said. The men exchanged looks of disbelief. They weren't just being mean. They genuinely thought she was delusional. In their world, size and noise were the markers of strength. Cassidy was lean, maybe 5'6". and she didn't make a sound when she moved. To them, she was invisible. Participate. Vance grinned, a predatory flash in his eyes. Sure, we'll get you some headgear and some padding. We wouldn't want you breaking a nail on your first day. It would be a nightmare to fill out all that paperwork. No padding necessary, she replied, her voice still hovering at that same, unshakable frequency. I'll meet you downstairs in 10 minutes. As she turned to walk toward the locker rooms, the group erupted into whispers and muffled jokes. Vance felt like he had already won. He figured he would put her in the ring with one of the junior guys. Let her get pushed around a little bit until she realized she was out of her league, and then she'd quit by lunch. It was a pattern he'd seen before with anyone he deemed soft. But as Cassidy walked away, she wasn't thinking about the insults. She wasn't feeling hurt or intimidated. She was doing something none of the men in that room were doing. She was scanning. She had noted the exits, the locations of the security cameras, the way Vance favored his left knee when he leaned against the counter, and the fact that the man by the weight rack had a slow reaction time when he reached for his water bottle. She had spent years in environments where being underestimated was her greatest weapon. In the Navy, she hadn't just been in the service. She had been part of a world that technically didn't exist to the general public. She had undergone training that broke the strongest men, and she hadn't just survived it, she had mastered it. In the locker room, she changed out of her blazer. Underneath, her arms were corded with lean, functional muscle, the kind that only comes from years of specialized combat training and high-intensity ops. She had scars on her shoulders and a small, faded tattoo on her inner wrist that most people would never recognize. But to those who knew, it meant everything. She pulled on a simple black t-shirt and tied her laces. She didn't need to get hyped up. She didn't need to yell or beat her chest. For her, what was about to happen wasn't a fight. It was a demonstration. Downstairs, the training floor was a massive expanse of gray mats and heavy bags. The men were already there, stretching and throwing heavy, labored punches at the bags, making sure the new girl saw how hard they hit. Vance stood in the center of the mat, looking like a king on his throne. He saw Cassidy enter and waved her over with a condescending flick of his wrist. "All right, boys, listen up," Vance shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The new lead wants to show us how it's done. Who wants to volunteer to give her a gentle introduction to the Sterling way?" He looked at her, his eyes mocking. He had no idea that in exactly 60 seconds, his entire world and his understanding of what a warrior looked like was about to be dismantled. Cassidy stepped onto the edge of the mat. She had traded her professional attire for a plain black t-shirt and workout pants, but she still didn't look like what these men expected. She didn't have the bulky, bodybuilding muscles that Vance and his crew spent hours cultivating in the gym. Her strength was hidden in her tendons and her core, built for endurance and explosive speed rather than for show. Vance looked around the room, his eyes landing on a younger guy named Jax. Jax was about 6'2", a former college wrestler who loved to prove how heavy his hands were. He was talented, but he was arrogant. He thrived on the fact that most people were afraid of him before the match even started. "Jax, why don't you give our new lead a little orientation?" Vance said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just keep it light. We don't want any HR complaints on a Monday morning. Just show her the basic defensive posture we use here." Jax stepped forward, bouncing on the balls of his feet. He had a wide, cocky grin on his face. He started rolling his shoulders, making a show of how much bigger he was than Cassidy. The other men lined up along the edge of the mat, some of them pulling out their phones. They expected a comedy video they could share later to laugh at the office lady who thought she could play with the big boys. "You ready for this?" Jax asked, his tone patronizing. "I'll go slow so you can keep up. If it gets too much, just tap my arm and I'll let go. No shame in it." Cassidy didn't say a word. She didn't even nod. She just stepped into the center of the circle. Her feet were shoulder-width apart, her knees slightly bent. It wasn't a flashy stance. It was the stance of someone who knew exactly where their center of gravity was. "Anytime you're ready," she said quietly. Jax didn't wait. He wanted to end this quickly so he could go back to his workout. He lunged forward, reaching out with a heavy, lazy hand to grab Cassidy's shoulder. He intended to just pull her off balance, maybe spin her around and show everyone how easy it was to control her. He expected her to flinch. He expected her to move backward in fear. Instead, Cassidy moved forward. It happened so fast that the guys watching on their phones didn't even see the transition. As Jax's hand closed on thin air, Cassidy stepped inside his reach. She didn't use a punch. She used his own momentum. She pivoted her hips, caught his extended arm at the wrist and elbow, and executed a perfect, fluid shoulder throw. The sound of Jax hitting the mat was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Thud. The air left his lungs in a sharp wheeze. He laid there for a second, staring at the ceiling tiles, completely confused about how he had gone from standing to horizontal in less than a second. The room went dead silent. The smirks on the men's faces didn't disappear. They just froze. Vance blinked, his mouth slightly open. He looked at Jax, then at Cassidy. She hadn't even broken a sweat. She was standing exactly where Jax had been a moment ago, her expression as calm as if she were waiting for a bus. "You okay, Jax?" she asked. It wasn't a taunt. It was a genuine question. "Your lead foot was too heavy. You gave me your balance." Jax scrambled to his feet, his face turning a bright, angry red. The embarrassment was worse than the fall. He could hear a few of his friends snickering, now not at Cassidy, but at him. He felt like he had to prove it was a fluke. "Lucky shot," Jax growled. He wiped his mouth and tucked his chin. This time, he didn't play around. He dropped into a real wrestling stance, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't going to try to grab her this time. He was going to tackle her. He shot in low, aiming for her waist. It was a powerful move, the kind of tackle that would have taken down a man twice her size. But Cassidy wasn't a stationary target. As Jax closed the distance, she sprawled backward with lightning precision, her hips driving into the back of his neck and shoulders, pinning his head toward the mat. Before Jax could react or try to turn, Cassidy spun behind him. It was a blur of black fabric and focused movement. In one smooth motion, she had his right arm trapped in a Kimura lock, a high-level submission hold. She didn't apply pressure. She just held it. Jax was stuck. He was a 220-pound athlete, and he was being held immobile by a woman who looked like she weighed 130 pounds, soaking wet. Every time he tried to buck or move, the grip tightened just enough to let him know that if she wanted to, she could end his career in a heartbeat. "Tap," Vance whispered from the sidelines. He sounded like he couldn't believe the word was coming out of his mouth. Jax gritted his teeth, struggling for another 5 seconds before realizing there was no escape. He reached out his free hand and tapped the mat 3 times. Tap, 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 tap. Cassidy released the hold instantly and stood up. She offered him a hand. Jax looked at her hand, looked at the floor, and eventually took it. She pulled him up with a strength that surprised him all over again. "Your entries are powerful," she told him, her voice still level and professional. "But you're predictable. You decide what you're going to do before you see what your opponent is doing. That gets people killed in the field." Jax didn't argue. He just nodded and backed away toward the edge of the mat, his ego completely deflated. Vance stepped forward now. He wasn't laughing anymore. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from a playground to a pressure cooker. The men realized they weren't watching a diversity hire or a librarian. They were watching someone who had been trained to a level they had only read about in manuals. "Who are you?" Vance asked. His voice didn't have the bravado from the lobby. He looked at her closely now, noticing for the first time the way she carried herself, the way her eyes never stopped scanning the room, the way she stayed perfectly balanced even when she was just standing still. "I told you," she said. "I'm the new tactical lead, and we're only 5 minutes into the evaluation." Vance took off his watch and handed it to the guy next to him. He stepped onto the mat, his jaw set. He was the head instructor, the big dog of the facility. If he didn't do something, he would lose the respect of his team forever. "All right," Vance said, cracking his neck. "Let's see if that works on someone who's actually expecting it." Cassidy didn't move. She just waited. The rest of the men leaned in, holding their breath. They were about to see their boss go up against the woman they had spent the morning mocking. Vance stepped into the center of the mat with a heavy, deliberate stride. He was much larger than Jax, and he had the kind of seasoned muscle that came from decades of physical labor in combat sports. He didn't rush in like a rookie. He moved like a hunter, circling slowly, keeping his hands up and his chin tucked. He wanted to intimidate Cassidy with his shadow, hoping that his sheer physical presence would make her hesitate. The guys on the sidelines were dead silent now. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was checking their phones for messages. They were all staring at the two figures on the mat, realizing that the hierarchy of their office was about to be decided in the next few minutes. Vance was their leader, the man who had set the tone for the entire company. If he lost, the culture of the building changed forever. "I'm going to be honest," Vance said, his voice low and gritty. "I don't know what kind of sport fighting you did to get that lucky toss on Jax, but this is the real world. In a real fight, size matters. Strength matters. I'm not going to let you dance around me." Cassidy didn't respond with words. She didn't even change her expression. She simply shifted her weight, a tiny movement in her feet that changed her entire center of gravity. She wasn't looking at Vance's face or his fists. She was looking at the triangle, the space between his shoulders and his chest. She was watching his breathing. She saw the way his diaphragm tightened just before he moved. Vance lunged. He didn't try a wrestling move or a flashy kick. He used a heavy, straight punch, a jab-cross combination designed to overwhelm her. He was fast for his size, and his fists were like heavy stones. Cassidy didn't move backward, to the shock of everyone watching. She moved toward the danger. As the first punch came whistling toward her face, she slipped her head just inches to the left. The air from the punch brushed her ear. Before Vance could pull his hand back for a second strike, Cassidy's hand shot out like a whip. She didn't hit him with a closed fist. She used the palm of her hand to redirect his elbow, turning his own power against him. Vance stumbled forward, his balance momentarily broken. He growled in frustration and swung a wide, desperate hook. It was a brawl move, the kind of strike a man uses when he's losing his cool. Cassidy went under the punch. She looked like a shadow moving through a doorway. She stayed so close to him that he couldn't generate any power. This was the hallmark of her training, the close-quarters combat that she had mastered in the dark corners of the world, where there was no room to swing a fist. She placed one hand on the back of his neck and the other on his lead hip. With a quick, surgical twist of her body, she tripped his supporting leg. Vance didn't just fall. He collapsed. He hit the mat with a sound that felt like it shook the floor joists. He tried to roll over and get back up, but Cassidy was already there. She didn't use a sport wrestling hold this time. She moved with a frightening efficiency that looked more like a machine than a person. She placed her knee across his lower back, pinning him in a way that made it impossible for him to use his massive arms for leverage. With one hand, she controlled both of his wrists behind his back. It was a classic restraint, but executed with such speed that it looked like magic. Vance was face down on the mat, his face pressed into the gray foam, completely immobilized. "You're dead," she whispered. The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the far wall. Vance was breathing hard, his chest heaving against the floor. He tried to thrash, tried to use his weight to buck her off, but every time he moved, she adjusted her pressure with a clinical precision. She wasn't using strength. She was using physics. "If this were the field," Cassidy said, her voice echoing in the silence, "you wouldn't be breathing right now. You left your right side open because you were too busy trying to look tough for your friends. You fought with your ego, Vance. And ego is the first thing that gets you killed." She let go and stepped back, giving him room to breathe. Vance stayed on the floor for a long moment. His face was bright red, partly from the physical struggle, but mostly from the crushing weight of his own embarrassment. He had spent years building a reputation as the toughest man in the room, and in less than 60 seconds, a woman half his size had treated him like a beginner. He pushed himself up slowly. His joints ached, but his pride ached more. He looked around at his team. The men who'd been laughing in the lobby were now looking at the floor. They couldn't even meet his eyes. The alpha of the pack had been dismantled in front of everyone. "Who are you?" Vance asked again. This time the question wasn't a challenge. It was a plea for information. He needed to know that he hadn't just been beaten by a nobody. He needed there to be a reason why she was so much better than him. "I'm Cassidy," she said, picking up a towel to wipe a single bead of sweat from her forehead. "And like I said, I'm here to fix your numbers." At that exact moment, the heavy double doors at the end of the gym swung open. A man in a tailored suit walked in. It was the CEO of the firm, a man who rarely set foot in the training area. He was carrying a thick manila folder, and his expression was dead serious. "I see you've all met our new lead," the CEO said, his voice booming. He walked over to Cassidy and shook her hand with a level of respect the men had never seen him show anyone else. "I apologize for the delay, Cassidy. HR just finished processing the high-level clearance documents." The CEO turned to the group, noticing Vance's disheveled appearance and the stunned looks on everyone's faces. He smiled, but it wasn't the kind smile. It was a knowing one. "I assume she's already given you a taste of what she brings to the table?" the CEO asked. Vance just nodded, unable to find his voice. "Good," the CEO continued, opening the folder, "because I think it's time you all realized exactly whose instructions you'll be following from now on. You aren't just looking at a tactical consultant. You're looking at one of the most decorated combat instructors in modern history." He pulled out a sheet of paper and began to read. As the words left his mouth, mentions of specialized naval units, black belt certifications in 4 different disciplines, and commendations for bravery under fire. The men felt the air leave the room. They hadn't just underestimated the new girl. They hadn't just underestimated the new girl. They had insulted a living legend. The CEO, a man named Sterling, who had seen his fair share of high-stakes negotiations, didn't look at the men. He looked at Cassidy with a nod of profound professional courtesy. He then turned the manila folder toward the group, resting it on a waist-high equipment locker so they could see the official seals and the heavy-duty watermarks of the Department of Defense. "You guys like to talk about real-world experience," Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave. "You like to brag about your 2 years in the suburbs or your time behind a desk in the Capitol. Well, let's talk about reality." He pulled out a photograph from the file. It wasn't a studio portrait. It was a grainy, heat-soaked image of a woman in full tactical gear, standing in a desert landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. She was covered in dust, holding a specialized carbine. In her eyes, the same steady brown eyes currently staring at Vance, looked like they had seen things that would keep most people awake for a decade. 10 years, Sterling began, his finger tapping the paper. Cassidy didn't just serve. She was part of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. When the Navy needed to test how to integrate high-level hand-to-hand combat with modern extraction techniques, they didn't call a gym owner. They called her. The men leaned in, their breathing shallow. One of the guys in the back, a younger veteran named Reed, squinted at the file. He recognized the unit insignia on the corner of the document. His face went pale. He had heard stories about this specific group of units so quiet and so effective that most regular soldiers only spoke about them in whispers over a beer. She's a master instructor in 3 different combat systems, Sterling continued, flipping the page. She's been a black belt since most of you were still trying to figure out how to do a proper push-up. But more importantly, she spent 5 years as a lead trainer for the most elite teams in the world. She wasn't just in the Navy. She was the person the Navy sent their best guys to when they needed to get better. Vance was still standing in the center of the mat, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The sting in his shoulder from the throw was nothing compared to the sinking feeling in his stomach. He realized now why her movements felt so different. There was no waste. There was no performance. Everything she did was designed to end a threat as quickly as possible. The client who hired us for this new contract, Sterling asked, looking directly at Vance. They didn't hire Sterling Security because of your workout videos on Instagram, Vance. They hired us on the condition that we bring in a specialist to overhaul our entire training wing. They specifically requested her by name. And do you know what I had to do to get her to agree to come here? I had to promise her that this team was professional, disciplined, and ready to learn. Sterling looked around the room, his eyes landing on the phones that were still clutched in a few of the men's hands. Instead, I walk in and find out you've been treating a world-class operator like a secretary. You've been filming her like she's a sideshow act. The phones were pocketed instantly. The silence in the gym was heavy, thick with the weight of collective shame. These were men who lived by a code of respect and hierarchy. And they had just committed the ultimate sin. They had disrespected a superior officer of the highest caliber because they were blinded by their own prejudices. Cassidy finally spoke. She hadn't moved an inch while Sterling spoke. She didn't look proud or smug. She just looked tired of the drama. The credentials don't matter, she said, her voice cutting through the tension. What matters is what happened 10 minutes ago. I walked into this building with a mission to make you better. You looked at my shoes, you looked at my height, and you decided I had nothing to offer. In the field, that kind of bias is what gets a team ambushed. If you assume the person standing in front of you is weak because they don't look like you, you've already lost the fight. She walked over to Vance. He flinched slightly, an instinctive reaction he couldn't control. She didn't attack him. She reached out and adjusted the collar of his shirt, which had been twisted during the fall. You have good reflexes, Vance, she said calmly, but you're heavy on your heels and you telegraph your right hook by dipping your shoulder. A teenager with a week of training could see that coming. If I can see it, a real enemy will see it. And they won't be as nice as I was. Vance cleared his throat. He looked at the floor, then at Sterling, and finally, he forced himself to look Cassidy in the eye. I didn't know. That's the point, Cassidy replied. You never know. That's why you treat everyone like they're the most dangerous person in the room until proven otherwise. That is the first rule of survival. Sterling closed the folder with a sharp clap. All right, the circus is over. Cassidy is your new commanding lead for this project. Her word is law on this floor. If anyone has a problem with that, my door is open, and you can hand in your resignation on the way out. Sterling turned and walked out, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind him. For a long minute, nobody moved. The men were waiting for Cassidy to yell, to gloat, or to fire someone. It's what they would have done if the roles were reversed. They expected her to use her new power to crush them the way they had tried to crush her spirit that morning. But Cassidy just walked over to her leather messenger bag, pulled out a whistle and a stopwatch. She didn't look angry. She looked like she was ready to get to work. "Line up," she said. It wasn't a scream. It was a command. And this time, nobody hesitated. Not even for a second. 20 grown men, many of them larger and heavier than her, scrambled into a perfect, straight line. Even Vance took his place in the middle of the row, standing at attention, his eyes fixed on the wall in front of him. "We're going to start from the beginning," Cassidy said, walking down the line. "We're going to talk about balance. We're going to talk about humility. And then, we're going to talk about humility. And then, we're going to talk about how to actually survive a fight." She stopped in front of Jax, the wrestler she had humbled first. He was sweating, his face still flushed. "Jax," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he responded instantly. "Drop and give me 50. Not because you lost, but because you hesitated when I told you to tap. In my world, hesitation is a habit. Let's break it." Jax hit the floor and started counting. The sound of his palms hitting the mat was the only noise in the room. The rest of the men stood perfectly still, realizing that the new girl was the most formidable leader they had ever encountered. 6 months had passed since the morning Cassidy first walked into the Sterling Security headquarters. The atmosphere in the gym was no longer thick with the smell of cheap ego and loud jokes. Instead, it smelled of hard work and quiet focus. The men who used to spend their mornings bragging about their bench press numbers were now focused on the subtle mechanics of movement and the discipline of mental clarity. The training floor was a different world. It was 6 a.m., and the entire team was already there. They weren't waiting for a boss to tell them to start. They were already in deep practice. Vance, once the loudest voice in the room, was in a corner working with a new recruit. He wasn't mocking the kid for being slow. He was patiently showing him how to keep his center of gravity low, using the exact words Cassidy had used on him months ago. When Cassidy entered the room, she didn't have to say a word to get their attention. She didn't wear a uniform that shouted her rank. She was in her usual black workout gear, her movements still as silent and efficient as a cat. As she stepped onto the mat, the room fell into a respectful silence. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the silence of professional athletes waiting for their coach. "Circle up," she said. The men moved with a synchronized precision that would have been impossible half a year ago. They formed a perfect perimeter around her. They looked different. They were leaner, their eyes were sharper, and the arrogant puff in their chests had been replaced by a grounded, steady confidence. "Today is the final evaluation before the overseas deployment," Cassidy announced. She looked at each man, making eye contact. The client isn't looking for heroes. They aren't looking for people who want to be in a movie. They are looking for a team that functions as a single organism. If one of you fails to check your ego, the whole unit collapses. She turned to Vance. "Vance, your lead on the first simulation. Show me you've learned how to listen to the environment, not just your own heartbeat." The simulation began. It was a complex drill involving a simulated high-value asset extraction. In the past, Vance would have charged in, trying to be the tough guy and take all the credit. But today, he was different. He moved with a calculated stillness. He communicated in short, whispered bursts over the radio. When a threat popped up in the simulation, he didn't try to overpower it with brute force. He used a swift, technical takedown that looked exactly like something Cassidy would do. From the observation deck, the CEO, Sterling, watched the drill with a satisfied smile. He leaned against the railing, looking down at the transformation. He remembered how close he had been to firing half of this team for their toxic behavior. Now, they were the highest performing unit in the company's history. When the drill ended, The men were dripping with sweat, their lungs burning. They gathered back in the center of the mat. Vance stepped forward, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at Cassidy, waiting for the critique. "Better," she said. "Your timing was off by 2 seconds on the secondary breach, but your awareness was 100% higher than last month. You didn't fight the scenario, you flowed with it." Vance nodded. He hesitated for a second, then spoke up. "Ma'am, I think I speak for everyone when I say, we're glad you didn't walk out that first day. We were a bunch of idiots who thought we knew everything because we had loud voices. You taught us that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who doesn't feel the need to prove it." A few of the other men nodded in agreement. It was a rare moment of vulnerability in a world that usually demanded toughness at all costs. "You weren't idiots," Cassidy said, a small, rare smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You were just comfortable. And comfort is the enemy of growth. You've worked harder in the last 6 months than most people do in 6 years. You earned your spot on this team. Not because of your resumes, but because of your willingness to be wrong." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. Inside were 20 small, blackened steel pins. They were simple, no flashy colors, no gold plating. They were the insignia of the elite tactical integration unit she had founded. One by one, she called them forward. When it was Vance's turn, she pinned the steel emblem to his shirt. "Don't wear this to show off," she told him quietly. "Wear it to remind yourself that there is always someone faster, always someone smarter, and always someone better. Your job is to make sure you're ready for them anyway." "Yes, ma'am," Vance replied, his voice thick with genuine pride. As the session ended, the men began to pack up their gear. The atmosphere was light but disciplined. They were no longer a group of individuals competing for the top spot. They were a brotherhood. Cassidy stood by the glass doors, watching them leave. She picked up her leather messenger bag, the same one she had carried on her first day. As she walked toward the exit, she passed the front desk where Vance had once tried to belittle her. The new receptionist, a young woman who had just started a week ago, looked up and smiled. "Have a good evening, Cassidy. Is there anything you need before you head out?" Cassidy stopped and looked at the girl. She saw a bit of herself in the young woman's bright, eager eyes. She also noticed that the girl was sitting with perfect posture, her eyes scanning the lobby every time the door opened. "Just one thing," Cassidy said. "Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong in the room. And if they try, make sure they remember the day they met you." The girl blinked, a bit surprised by the intensity of the advice, but she nodded firmly. "I will. Thank you." Cassidy walked out into the cool evening air. The sun was setting over the Virginia skyline, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She got into her car, a modest vehicle that blended in perfectly with the thousands of others on the road. She wasn't looking for fame. She wasn't looking for a thank you. She was a professional who had done her job. She had taken a broken, arrogant system and turned it into something honorable. As she drove away, she looked in the rearview mirror at the Sterling building. The lights in the gym were still on. Inside, 20 men were still training, even though their shift was over. They weren't doing it because they had to. They were doing it because they had to. They were doing it because they finally understood what it meant to be a true warrior. The new girl had left her mark, and the men she had brutally humbled were now the best men they had ever been.